All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. My name is Emily Wilkins, and I'm the 117th president of the National Press Club and a correspondent here with CNBC. That's not even a club. I'm not important. It's Heather. We're here for Heather.
You're the ones doing the work.
Well, thank you guys, of course, for joining us this evening for our conversation with Heather Cox Richardson. We are happy, by the way, of course, to accept questions, as we always do here at the National Press Club. If you would like to submit a question, please email headliners@press.org and write your question, write your question there. Or I believe you have cards at your seat. You can also write a question there. Please make it as legible as humanly possible, because I'm going to have to read it. And you can pass them to Madison. I don't see her in the room right now, but the second she sneaks in, she can point them to Jen. Jen is the lovely lady up there in the green dress and the pearls. And Jen will sneak them up here, and we will read them out loud. All right. Journalists tend to envy historians, because we imagine that you guys have unlimited time to consider what has happened before writing about it. And I have also heard that historians envy journalists because they imagine that millions of people read our bylines every day. On our best days, journalists and historians share a deep curiosity about the world, a commitment to seeking and presenting the truth, and the ability to connect with audiences in ways that impact lives. Our guest tonight, Heather Cox Richardson, combines the long view of an academic historian with the drive of a breaking news reporter. I lost my place. Hold on. There we are. With her popular newsletter and podcast, Professor Richardson is doing for American history what Bill Nye does for science or Julia Child did for French cooking. She is Ken Burns in 13 minutes a day, a Joe Rogan with progressive politics, or Mark Twain on TikTok. In her day job, Richardson is a professor of history at Boston College. She has written award-winning books about the Civil War, Reconstitution, the Gilded Age, the American West, the state of American democracy, and the history of the Republican Party through the first Trump administration. Most of us here tonight know her because of her newsletter and podcast called Letters from an American, which began in 2019 as an occasional Facebook post and has now grown into a nightly addiction for 3 million people around the world. Richardson has created her own brand as a historian with an eye on the news and as a journalist with a deep understanding of history. She might not describe herself as an influencer, but she does want and expect Americans to stand up for their rights and to participate in democracy. Professor Richardson humbly defines her role as a note-taker for the American conversation, and we're so pleased to have her join us at the National Press Club tonight. If we can all give her a warm National Press Club welcome to Heather Cox Richardson.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. I'm laughing at the idea of influencer. I just got lost in the hall. You're following me, you're in real trouble.
Well, Heather, I want to start off by if you can start off with your story about kind of how you became someone a professor, writing a lot of very acclaimed books about American history. How did you actually begin your newsletter? I hear it's a very interesting story, and there might be a wasp that is involved.
Yellow Jacket. So the question of why I do history actually comes out of where Buddy is here, by the way. He usually sits in the back trying to hide, but he's over here. Where he and I grew up, not knowing each other actually. We grew up where people told stories. They always told stories about their lives, but it didn't take very long listening to those stories to recognize that the stories didn't match. And one of the things that one did was recognize that when people told stories, they often told stories that said more about them than the events that were happening. So I went through school both in Maine and then at Phillips Exeter Academy and then at Harvard and hated it. I was not a student. I hated it. And my parents just said, finish. Please just finish. They were much older and they were like, please just let us get you through college. And I took a course in the American Civil War with David Donald, who's a Pulitzer Prize winner and just a riveting lecturer, and was supposed to be writing an essay on the Civil War, and was not doing what one would call putting my heart into my education. Or rather, I spent all my time in the library and not in the classroom. But I went to figure out what I was going to write this paper about. And I went down to what was called GovDocs, Government Documents at Harvard. If any of you know that building, it's underground, and because there are these old documents and these films, they keep it very cold. And I'm not a breakfast eater, and I didn't drink coffee at the time. So I went down into GovDocs about 10 o'clock in the morning, and I started to read the Chicago Tribune for the Civil War years. And I knew nothing about the Civil War, except basically who won it, you know, who lost it, and a few of the names. So I wasn't looking for anything. I was just sort of like, there's got to be something here I can write a paper about. And I started to read with the coming of the war. And the Chicago Tribune's only 4 pages long during the war and tour advertising, so this sounds more impressive than it is. But I read through the Chicago Tribune, through breakfast, of course, and then through lunch. And I lived the Civil War. And then I read through dinner. And by then I'm really cold because they kept it in the 60s and I hadn't eaten all day. And I lived the war down there by myself because nobody else was in GovDocs, you know, shocker. And it was in one of those machines where you turn the crank. And the film kept going by. I would turn it, and you know, there was the battle for Island Number 10, which I'd never heard of. And then there's all the stories about the soldiers who were captured in women's clothing, which is, you know, was a myth at the time. And you know it because you know about the idea of Jefferson Davis being captured in petticoats. That was a trope in the war. And I'm reading through all this stuff, and I'm reading through the president's proclamations and the horrible lists of dead. And then Lee surrendered. It's very late at night. I turned the crank and Lee surrendered. And I thought, I knew about that, but I thought, my God, we won. The war is over. We won. And I turned the crank, and the Chicago Tribune was bordered in black. And they had shot Lincoln. And I knew, of course, that Lincoln was going to die, but it was real to me. And I went home that night. I got through the rest of the war, and I went home that night when the library closed, and I wrote to my mother and said, I know what I'm going to do with my life. I'm going to make history come as alive to everybody else as it has to me. And when she died, that was still by her desk. So one of the things that I have always tried to do when I write books is to explain why things matter. What are we doing? Why do any of these stories matter? And the way the letter started was I'd written a number of books, and I have to say I was a decent writer, but not a good writer. I was a decent writer. And I had been writing on Facebook since the Republican book came out, about once a week, an essay about something, about my life, about art, about something I was interested in that week. And I hadn't written for a number of weeks because I was moving, Buddy and I were moving in together. I was trying to paint my house and hadn't written, and I was trying to paint the windows around my house so somebody else could move in, and I got stung by a yellow jacket, and I didn't have my EpiPen. I'm allergic. And my brother-in-law, bless his heart, was there with me, and we live a long way from medical care. And he looks at me and goes, Heather, I'll get your EpiPen. And I said, oh, Chris, you're not going to want to hear this. And he said, it's at the other house, isn't it? I'll go to the other house and get your EpiPen. And I said, oh, Chris, you're really not going to want to hear this. And I can still see he turns and he goes, you don't have your EpiPen, do you? And his eyes narrow and he goes, if you don't die, I'm going to kill you. So then I went to sit and see how badly I was going to react, and I thought, well, I haven't written an essay in forever because I've been painting and moving and all that, and people were worried about me. And so I wrote about what the world looked like in America on September 15th of 2019, which was 2 days after then chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, had written the letter of September 13th of that year to the acting director of national intelligence to say that they knew, they had been told that he was withholding a whistleblower complaint, and that because he was withholding it against the law that suggested that it was somebody important in the administration, I knew that was the first time that a member of the legislative branch had accused a member of the executive branch of breaking a specific law, not generally you're corrupt, but a specific law. So I mentioned that. By the time I decided I was okay to drive back to Boston, by the time I got there were thousands of questions, and I thought, I'm not going to write again, because who's going to flood the zone and want to read me every night, right? So I didn't write that next night on the 16th, I wrote the 17th, and I've written every night since.
Wow. What do you think it's been about Letters from an American that's really resounded with so many people over so much time?
I don't know, because truthfully, once they're gone, I don't go back and read them. I will tell you all that some are really, really good. And I have become a good writer. There's a lot of crap there too. There's a lot of stuff that's just me putting down the record that looks really important, and then months later you're like, what happened there again? I think that the reason that I think they're interesting is because I won't put it on paper unless I understand it. Quick, well, we're in Washington, so you probably all know this. What's the difference between the G7 and the G20? I mean, I don't know. I have to look it up every single time. And there's always this conversation in the public sphere that presupposes you know things. And you do kind of, but by the time you're trying to remember if you bought peas for dinner and, whether there's gas in the car and when the last time was you vacuumed, you're not going to sit there and go, oh, I remember when Indonesia made that law, So I always explain everything with the possible exception of who the president is. After a while, I think that's good enough. And I say why it's important. And I only react to things that have happened, not that might happen, and I put them in a historical context, because what I'm really trying to do is write for somebody in 150 years who looks back and says, what happened on January 16th and why is it important?
So they can sit there in a freezing cold room in a basement and go through all of your newsletters.
That's not entirely illegitimate way to look at it, because as a historian, there are a number of diaries that we live by. George Strong for the Civil War was in Washington, you may know that. Rutherford B. Hayes kept a diary his whole life, and I hope there's nobody here who's a huge fan of Rutherford B. Hayes, because I'm going to say I wish it were more interesting. Mary Chestnut, we live for these things, and there is nothing worse than being like, oh my God, look what's happening. I wonder what George Strong says about it. And you get there and he's like, felt ill, stayed home. And you're like, no. And the nights when I'm like, I'm just too tired, I think that poor graduate student in 150 years is going to be like, no, you can't be tired today. So I do try and put something on the page every day. And on the days I take off, which I do for you all, I still write on those days, but people need a break, they have told me. You'll notice they come in the next day so that she can go, phew, she covered that the next day.
You mentioned that you have some favorites. So I'm curious what they are. Favorite newsletters that you've written.
I have no idea. I had to read through a bunch of them recently, and I mean, everybody thinks that all the ones I write are that good. There are some that sing. I wrote one recently that sang. I can't remember which one it was. I love the one on Dorothy Thompson, if you remember that one. But my point was only that not all of them are gems. People think they are, and they're really not.
We're a bunch of reporters. We understand
That's
that.
right.
Totally. It's just like there's some days like I hit that one out of the ballpark, and there's some days like I got on first base. It's fine. It'll be fine. So you have gone from kind of, as I said, writing books to writing a newsletter. How has that kind of changed in terms of you interacting with the people who read your stuff? From sort of people who will read a book when it comes out every couple of years versus people who are literally reading and interacting with your newsletter, with your podcast, and with other forms of your media every day?
I think the big difference for me is we're a community. When you write a book, which by the way I'm doing right now, it's really you and the page, or you and the laptop and your editor, and it's a gestation kind of thing. There's an immediacy to the newsletter where I am literally answering the questions that people write and ask me. And I think I really do think when I write a book, there is, I'm trying to advance a new idea in the world. The newsletters are much more an attempt to ground the American people in a fact-based reality, to underscore the importance, the Enlightenment idea of the fair exchange of ideas. And there is much more of a sense of we are building something together. That, I don't sit there and say, what am I going to convince people all the time want me to take positions in that newsletter. And I don't. I take positions on my webcast as something very different. Because that project of the newsletter is much more a reflection of the American people and this community we're building. And that's, it's just an entirely different feel. And weirdly, when I sit to write the newsletter, it is almost never that I stare at the page and I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to do. If any of you are writers, you know, that's the best way to clean your house is to decide to write a book. Because I'm laughing at this lady down here knitting because I'm a knitter too. And I started a baby blanket for a book. It became a king-size Afghan. Because I'm like, I'll just knit a row or two while I think. And the thing is like, it practically would cover this thing. The newsletter, I sit down, I write it. It's not I just write it. I mean, there's errors and it takes forever and all that, but there's none of that, I'll just go clean my kitchen thing. I can sit in the same chair with the same laptop, the same playlist, the same everything, flip to the screen that is the book, and I'm like, damn, I haven't cleaned the basement in like 10 years. So I just think there's a really different thing going on there.
Interesting. Do you find that there are certain topics that when you write about them, you get more of that interaction from the community, more opinions, more debate, more disagreement, more controversy?
People love the history, which I love too, although I have to tell you, I got one letter cheering me on with Martin Van Buren. I am disappointed in all of you. I'm like, I gotta write about something different. And I'm doing a deep dive on Martin Van Buren right now. And I'm like, I know, I'll read about Martin Van Buren. And I'm like, boy, did that fall flat. People like history that ties into the present. The places I have really gotten pushback and angry pushback is people very much want me to take a position on Gaza. And that's really interesting because I am always trying to explain the politics of what is happening in American foreign affairs. I can't do another country, but in American foreign affairs, and just saying this happened, this happened, this happened, but people want me to take a position on that. And it has gotten so bad, people complain that I don't talk about it enough, and it's true, but you cannot imagine how bad the hate mail is that I get. And I'm very used to hate mail. But I mean, this is beyond death and rape threats. It's really, really bad stuff.
Oh my gosh. Has that, and sorry, I'm going to put a very quick pin in this to say, I know there are a couple folks who have questions in their hands and they're like, how do I get them to Jen? If you just want to like toss it up in the air a little bit, she's walking around the room, so she will come and she will get you. Okay, back to the point on the death threats.
Do you get death threats?
I'm kind of surprised I don't, to be honest, because I know a lot of reporters who do.
It's pretty common.
I know a lot of reporters who get death threats, who get inappropriate emails. It might be because CNBC is not. If you are like really,
good work,
thank you, I appreciate it. But if you are like really like amped up about politics, you are probably watching a different news channel.
Isn't that interesting though? Actually, because maybe you can get away with it because you're CNBC.
I'm not trying to get away with anything.
No,
I am glad I don't have any death threats though. That's a plus. Yeah. I mean, has that changed? I mean, since you started writing your newsletter and having your webcast, have you seen more of that animosity? And how have you dealt with that? Because I know that's something that more and more reporters are experiencing now or embracing themselves to experience.
Okay, so I've had a long history of trouble with the radical right. Beginning when I wrote an article for a children's magazine that said that Lincoln had tried to stay within the bounds of the Constitution during the Civil War. I mean, it was a children's magazine, and it was pretty basic. Great magazine, by the way, Cobblestone. And that got me on a list, and I think that that's where Charlie Kirk picked up my name to be on his initial professor watch list. And I got a lot of really bad stuff in that era. But what was really interesting to me is, you may or may not remember this, I responded to Kirk's professor watch list in November of 2017 with a post that went viral. It went from my Facebook page, this is long before the letters, to Bill Moyers picked it up and it went viral. And if you've noticed, the people who are in power almost never mention me. They took me off the professor watch list the next day because they only punch down, they don't punch up. So if you think about what the people in power do now, or soon to be in power do now, is they tend to try and pick off the weak members of the herd. And by refusing to be a weak member of the herd, that has changed that dynamic dramatically. Now, what I do get still is a lot of what I would call keyboard warriors. Very few of them I worry about 2 a year I have to take to the police on average. My favorite though piece of hate mail ever, I should have saved it and I didn't, but my favorite, so I have how do I deal with it? I don't think a lot about it. I wondered why all the numbers were going down so far. I wasn't getting any hate mail at all for a while, and I was like, that's really funny. Why am I not getting any hate mail? And I had a new assistant, and I was actually looking through the files he did. He had created a new file called Hatey McHateface, and that's where he was putting everything. But my favorite piece of hate mail ever said, and I quote, "You are dumb." And I was like, I can't go on. I don't know. What can you do? It's where we are.
I mean, there are lots of thoughts on how to handle it, but I do want to move the conversation along because I do want to ask you about this moment in history that we are now in, and kind of looking forward to, of course, the inauguration next week, what the next 4 years could hold. How do you kind of think of this time as a historian, and what do you think you're going to be writing about through much of the next 4 years?
So I don't predict the future. I'm a prophet of the past, not of the future. But the question, the way you phrased it, is fine. As a historian, what am I looking at? I am looking at three things, I guess, primarily. One is the overturning of our democratic systems of government in America, but around the world. And what is that going to look like? And I am an agnostic on that. That is, I think the incoming administration is extraordinarily dangerous. I am extraordinarily concerned about every possible aspect of it, and I'm happy to talk about that. But one of the things you've heard me harp on is the fact that the Republican Party, and I am a historian of the Republican Party, is split in an inordinate amount of factions, and it is not clear to me how much they are going to be able to do. Those two things are going to be working against each other, so I'm going to watch that. I'm not making a prediction here, and some days I think, never mind. The next thing that I am looking at is the degree to which this current moment is characterized by misogyny. The fact that what we are really seeing is an attempt, I think, to get rid of a government that answers the needs of its citizens by associating that with women in American society. And I think there are echoes in other countries as well, but I can't speak to those. And the degree to which people will recognize what we are seeing as an attack on women and on women's rights in America, because that's a much larger symbol for, not only because that's a much larger symbol for other rights being eroded as well. So that I'm watching that on a daily basis, a minute-by-minute basis. But the third thing is really interesting as well, and that is people like me have looked forever at the extraordinary concentration of wealth upwards since 1981, about $50 trillion from the bottom 90% to the top 1%, and recognized that the right wing in America was using cultural issues to make sure there was not solidarity created across those people who were getting destroyed economically. And it was kind of shocking to people like me how long it was taking for people to wake up to this. If you ever looked, you would see that I talked about this in the Republican book, which came out in, I've talked about it in all my books really, but really the Republican book explicitly called it out, and that came out in, I don't remember when, 2004? I don't know, something, a while back. And, it just was like bubbling, but nothing was happening. And then when that dude shot the CEO, it was like the whole fabric ripped. At least it seems that way to me. And now you are seeing Laura Loomer and Steve Bannon turning on the tech bros. You're seeing the tech bros taking over Donald Trump. You're seeing Joe Biden last night, was it last night? Talking about America becoming an oligarchy. Well, this is not news to anybody who's been following America now for 40 years, but all of a sudden that has totally torn open. And that, in a moment when the richest man in the world has invested $277 million in electing the American president, and will be sitting on the dais near him with dignitaries when he takes office, at a time when, at the same time, people who believed that they were voting for Trump and the MAGA party because they were going to be defending the cultural interests of what they consider forgotten people. There is a tension there that echoes the 1850s to the 1860s, the 1890s to the 19aughts, and the 1920s to the 1930s. And in all of those cases, there are a number of things that happen. People start to be aware of what's going on because of a new technology. The westward expansion, industrialization, and it's a third, I don't know, globalization, there we go. Globalization. And then you also saw the rise of new media. In all three of those periods, you see the rise of new media. Well, look where we are now. We got 2 days ago, the Contrarian came out. And not just that, there's all these other things. So there are parallels in all these moments that are times when the American people have taken back American democracy. Or not. You know, I mean, I'm not going to predict that. It could go the other way. Lord knows we have images of that in other countries as well, but that's the historical parallels.
I mean, we have one question from the audience that I think kind of gets at that, that looking back in history, is the current situation politically one of the most serious or threatening situations facing democracy per se, especially in our country? Are we at a point where we're at a tipping point and a turning point, or do we kind of have further to go until we hit rock bottom?
Well, hey, listen, I thought we'd hit rock bottom 20 years ago. So I would say we are in the most dangerous moment in American history ever. And that's saying something.
Even more so than the Civil War?
Even more so than the Civil War.
Why?
Because during the Civil War, the Confederates left. And in this case, they have taken over the United States government. And that has never happened before. So, I mean, maybe you could say 1859 or 1860. And one of the things that I've been watching, never mind. So go ahead.
What were you going to say? One of the things that you've been watching?
Well, you're seeing all the, I don't know if you've been you know, I feed on media all day, and there were all kinds of stories that came out over the last week talking about how, okay, Biden did all this great stuff, but he ultimately failed because Trump got reelected. And poor Buddy, I think I said this to him the other day. It's rather like imagining Abraham Lincoln. And mind you, I'm not saying Biden is Abraham Lincoln, but it's almost imagining Abraham Lincoln trying to govern if the Confederates didn't leave. I mean, we would not have gotten national money. We would not have gotten the Land-Grant College Act. We would not have gotten industrialization. We would not have gotten all the things that we now credit Lincoln with if, in fact, he had to try and govern with the people within his actual Congress. And that's a piece of our political system I don't think a lot of people understand right now.
Yeah. You mentioned that you read a lot of media. What do you tend to read? What sources and news organizations and forms of media do you gravitate towards?
So what I do is this. I wake up in the morning and I begin to read social media and to see what stories people are talking about. To see, and there's a remarkable uniformity across them, but I have pretty heavily curated feeds, so I'm looking at a lot of different things. And then I go to Josh Marshall at Talking Points Memo once I start to actually look at news sources, because he has a PhD in history from Princeton and often looks at things with a very long lens to see what he's talking about. He's got great writers for him. And then once I do that, then I read major newspapers from across the country to see what their stories are. And then once I have a sense of what's happening, then I go to the White House, I go to State, I go to Commerce, I go to the major White House and you know, government things. And then I have a pretty good sense of what's happening. And then once I've decided what I think is happening on that particular day, then I will say, for example, recognize, and I'm just going to use this as an example, the changing of the guard at Voice of America. If you're going to do that, then you have to start digging into all sorts of European sources as well as Voice of America. Or another one of my favorites, you know, when I do something like trains, if there's a big story about trains, then I have to read the train literature. I don't read that every day. I figure out what the issues are, and then I do the deep dives.
Got it. And when you are writing these newsletters, this is another good question we have from the audience, from Viola, hello. You talk about the community that you're building. How much do you think that you're reaching beyond the proverbial choir? And is that something you think about, kind of reaching folks who, you know, might not normally want this stuff, or kind of might have a different interpretation of the history in the current times?
So that's a good question. You will note that I have never advertised or accepted advertising. And as you said, more than 3 million people read me every night. I will tell you anecdotally, I've never looked at my numbers, I've never done any of that. Anecdotally, I get a lot of letters from people who say they just want to understand this stuff and they are curious about what's happening. And I think actually one of the things about history is we share it. You know, when I talk about Abraham Lincoln, that's something all of us share. And one of the things I did recently was, that's a great example actually, I did that thing on North Carolina, what was happening in North Carolina. I had a general sense of what was happening in North Carolina, like everybody probably did. That piece, which was not terribly long, probably took me 12 to 14 hours to write, because it was very confusing about who was doing what when and how many votes were in what and, you know, all those different things. But, you know, I was on all the North Carolina newspapers to do that. So I would say, first of all, you preach to the choir because the choir sings. The reason that I have 3 million followers, or no, more than that followers than that, but 3 million readers a night is because people like you have said to your sister-in-law, you might want to take a look at this. And so you preach to the choir because the choir sings, but also I think there is a desperate hunger in this country for somebody who doesn't have a stake in modern politics. I'm not a politician. I'm happy to talk to anybody, but I'm on nobody's speed dial, nor are they on mine. And just, I think there's a hunger for people to have a voice they can trust. They can disagree with it, that's fine, but you know I'm not lying to you. Or if I make a mistake, I'll correct it.
Yeah.
Which I do, by the way.
And I'm wondering too, what does that relationship mean for the politicians that you've written about or that you've interviewed? Do they ever sort of follow up with you, or how do you sort of approach them? How do they approach you when it comes to what you've written about them?
So this is interesting about being a historian. This is so horrible, and I really can't see you, so I hope there isn't a politician here. To me, I'm not sure I can say this without it sounding awful. I study politics. Like, do you want to know anything about U.S. Grant? U.S. Grant is like my brother because I've spent so much time with him. But to me, they're all two-dimensional. They're all on paper. You know, they're not. I don't want to say they're not real, but they're on paper. And so it would never in a million years occur to me to reach out to somebody to say, you know, what do you think about this? Because I'm going to read all their policy papers. I'm going to read all that stuff. And I would use it if it were there, but it would never occur to me to do it. I don't believe any one of them has ever reached out to me, although when I have met them, which I do sometimes, they'll say, oh, I loved your column on whatever. Republicans, by the way, as well as Democrats. But I did have the really cool experience once, and now I can't remember who it was, I had written about a state politician in some state, maybe Illinois, and I happened to run into her. And somebody introduced her, and I was like a bird dog, and I went, I just wrote about you. And she's like, I know. So I think it's more kind of like reading about yourself in a modern day history book.
Interesting. And what about, because you got to sit down with President Biden and talk to him. What was that conversation like? How did that come about? What's the backstory?
So that's even better because he's a president, right? I know a lot of presidents really well. You know, do you want to know anything about Benjamin Harrison? I'm your girl. It's clear you don't want to know anything about Martin Van Buren, by the way. But if you did, I would be your girl, right? And so I know Biden really, really well. I know exactly what I think he thinks. And I set up questions sort of knowing what it was going to look like because, you know, I teach and I knew exactly what was going to go. And I asked him a question. He's like, nah, I don't think that way at all. And I'm like, yes, you do. You're not allowed to have opinions, because he was like talking back to me. Like he knew himself better than me, and I'm the historian. It was just the weirdest dynamic. Exactly. It was the weirdest dynamic.
Did you learn anything from that? I mean, as far as like what you had gleaned from all of the research and all of the readings versus like who he was when you're actually sitting down and talking with the man in 3D?
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, because here's a trick that I've always used when I write about people who are dead is you try and get to know them as well as you possibly can. And what I tend to do and a great example of this is Wade Hampton, who was a big South Carolina planter before the Civil War and then becomes active in politics afterward. And what you do is you try and get to know them as well as you can and then guess what they're going to do next. Because that means you know who they are. And if you do that and then you say, well, on this vote, I know how he's going to vote, and he does, you can be like, okay, I've nailed him, we're done. But sometimes they don't do it. And then you have to go back to the drawing board. And that's always, to me, a surprise, because I don't do that until I know him pretty well. And that's what I felt like with him. I'm like, ooh, man, I guess I better go back and reevaluate the way I was thinking about the way he thinks. Because I'm trying not to make value judgments about people in the present or the past, but to say this is how they think. Put it in front of you all, and you can agree with it or you can not agree with it. But I need to get that accurate.
Yeah. I'm also curious, and this is probably the most political we're going to get tonight, but I think a lot of the journalism community was caught a bit off guard by the fact that Biden's, just his debate in June, I think really surprised a lot of people. And I'm wondering, when you were chatting with him, did you get any inkling?
No. Okay. No, and this is, again, you bring personal experiences to stuff. One of my best friends growing up had a very severe stutter. So I don't hear it. I don't hear stuttering because that was just how she talked, and I got used to that. What I hear is a man and that's how I'm like, I know exactly what Trump is doing to him, because I know from my friend that this technique is brutal. Now, that doesn't speak to other things that were going on that night. I thought that Biden looked very tired. We know now that he was negotiating that 26 person exchange after the murder of Alexei Navalny, and that he didn't feel well and all that. But that all, again, he's responsible for the way he was when he got on that stage. But so no, I mean, he's quick. He's good on topics. I will say that one of the things that jumps out to me about him, and this is me, it's not him, so I am reading this on to him, but this is something, if I wrote his biography, which, by the way, I have zero interest in doing, not just because that's not where my heart is right now. Those of us who come from storytelling cultures, which is where I started this, repeat stories to reinforce community. And repeat phrases to reinforce community. That is a technique. It's a storytelling technique. It is absolutely comfortable to me. But I can see people who are not from communities like that listening to him and thinking, really, dude? You're going to tell us that story again?
Interesting. So there's like some
I've never heard
context
anyone
there.
mention that, but that jumped out to me. Because I was very comfortable with him. Once, really. That's the number of stories we tell and tell again. Think about it. You tell the same story with your grandparents or whatever, because it reinforces that long history.
That is a good point. That's a really good point. I will not get into all the stories that my family loves to tell, embarrassingly, about me to reinforce our community. But
yes,
we have another. There have been talks about the need to teach English and literature classes and history classes in tandem with each other. Do you think that, and this kind of goes with the storytelling, do you think that it's necessary to point out and discuss the parallels between events that occur in historical fiction and real life events?
Historical fiction?
Yeah, like the example they gave is I have a mouth and I must scream to discuss AI, or using the Hunger Games to discuss class oppression.
That's actually a really good question. I'm not entirely sure that I'm going to answer exactly what you were asking, but there's actually two big questions in that. That is how we study, and I'm going to go only with America as usual here, how we study those things and how we teach those things. And when we study and look at America, I'm actually not trained as a historian. I was trained in the program in the history of American civilization. So my master's degree is actually in literature. My third field was religion, which you would never know from reading me, but because I realize I don't write about it much. And I don't really know why. But when we study America, I think there are different professions. There's different theoretical things beyond this. What historians do is they study how and why societies change. And that's what we do. So that's why we look for patterns. That's how we're looking at how different groups change the world. And we're trying to see where the levers are that change things. What people who study American civilization, we called it, but became American Studies. If anybody's here in the audience, we could talk longer about that. It's fairly complicated. But what those people were trying to do, the way I was trained, was to figure out why American culture did not slide into fascism or communism in the periods in the 1920s to the 1950s, really. That was what they were really interested in. And I don't think they got the answers right, but what they said is you can't, personally, but you can't understand a people by only studying their history. You have to study their art, you have to study their literature, you have to study their movies, you have to study all of those things in order to understand that. And I absolutely agree with that. You see that more in my books than you do in the Letters from an American. So I think when you study America, you must study art and literature and film and music and physics and all those things put together. But that's different than when you teach them. And there's a big argument when you teach about what one is teaching. And there are two ways to look at it. There are people who think that teachers must be advocates for certain positions, and that was captured, for example, by Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who talked a lot about how we needed to inculcate values of progressive democracy into American students. That was countered by the great historian John Hope Franklin in a wonderful article that he published in The Historian, in which he said, when historians start to advocate for political positions, they have given up history and become politicians. And reasonable people can disagree about that. I fall firmly with John Hope Franklin, that in my classrooms, I want you to understand how we do history or literature, how we do those things, and within that, I want you to be able to make decisions that you think are correct based on your understanding of the world. I do not want you to parrot anything back to me, because to me that undermines the concept of the Enlightenment. And what I'm trying to do is convince people to make their own choices about the world in which they live. Now, as I say, people disagree about those things, and I've had arguments about them with colleagues who can make just as strong arguments on the side that you need to teach people how to think about the material. I fall on the other category, and I do think there's room to disagree about that.
Interesting, interesting. I also want to do, we kind of set it up with a fun little lightning round. I'm going to go ahead and name a modern political leader, and you tell us the historical figure that you are reminded of. Ready?
Okay.
All right. This first one's not going to be a surprise. Donald Trump.
Warren G. Harding.
Why Warren G. Harding?
Oh, you didn't say I had to say
I know,
why.
I know. I changed the rules midway through.
But we
all want
you
to
said
know.
lightning.
But we all want
okay,
to know.
So the obvious one was Huey Long, right? But Warren G. Harding, because Harding was in way over his head and he was used by other people, and his administration ended up being incredibly corrupt. And I don't think Trump is going to do this, but Harding was this, what did Alice Roosevelt call him? Said he was just a slob.
I've got
his administration was like totally corrupt. I might write about it tonight, actually, now that I think about it.
I will look forward to reading it. Joe Biden.
Historical figure like Joe Biden. I'm stalling for time here. I can't believe I've never thought of this. A historical figure. Well, the obvious one is FDR, but that's too obvious. FDR. Well, I'd say Lincoln, but I don't think we're going to have a monument to Biden. But that idea of trying to legislate for the people when you're facing an insurgency, that's hard to see anywhere else.
How about House Speaker Mike Johnson?
Oh, Mike Johnson's easy. But you're not going to know any of the people that I'm going to talk about because nobody knows 19th century House Speakers.
Do you want to do like the name and then kind of like the 30-second why?
No, let me just tell you who they are.
Okay.
If you look at House Speakers and if you look at the progression of political leaders in a party, any party, you start with insurgents who are really good at organizing people to overturn the old guard. And then those people become the institutionalists, who are the ones who manage to try and preserve the power of the people, and they're the backroom cigar-smoking dealers. Think John Boehner, for example. And then they end up getting thrown out again by the overturners. And that last group of people who are trying to stop the insurgents and keep the party together, you don't know any of their names because they all fell apart. Samuel Randall is who I'm thinking of.
All right. Kamala Harris.
I should have thought, I should have been able to think of these. Who does Kamala Harris remind me of? Give me some suggestions. See, it's hard, right? Margaret Chase Smith?
Is there a reason that you think it's difficult to find a historical twin for
Well,
Kamala Harris?
yes, because the obvious thing to say is that she was unique in the vice presidency, being a woman and a woman of color. But that's not why I think she matters. I think she matters, I mean, that too, I don't mean to denigrate that. But what always jumped out to me about her, because I did a pretty deep dive on her as well, and I've never obviously asked her about this, but it always seemed to me that what Biden was doing was he was protecting the FDR economic base of the Democratic Party. But that had always centered, oh, so I know who I've got, Frances Perkins. That had always centered around white men. And what Kamala Harris did was she expanded that to include women and especially children, but she insisted above all on the concept of equality, on America protecting equality before the law. So I'm going to go with Frances Perkins for her.
All right.
And that's a real compliment, by the way.
Yeah. Actually, I'm sorry. I'm going to take a personal point of privilege as a congressional reporter here and go back to Mike Johnson for a hot second. So you're saying that who's going to follow him is going to be the insurgents?
I don't think he can manage the Freedom Caucus.
Okay, so at some point we're going to see because I mean, I guess kind of it's what happened to Kevin McCarthy, right? Kevin McCarthy got ousted by the insurgents, but then when the insurgents put up their guy, they were not able to unify the caucus around them, and so they went with the guy who no one had anything against because he never held
their
a
fifth
leadership.
choice.
Yeah, he never held a
fifth
leadership position that would have
Right.
caused that kind of tension. So are we just going to have another person like that we've never heard of before, or do you think the insurgents
Well,
are
isn't this interesting? I don't know what's going to happen, because normally, in the periods I know, you would have had, you think about, there are a number of problems that we have in the country right now because we have lost the party structures, the backroom deals. And I'm not advocating for them or against them. I'm saying that we have lost some things. So one of the things that really jumps out to me, have you noticed that the people in Congress are all 645 years old? And in both parties. And it's not as bad as it was 2 years ago, which was our oldest Congress ever, but maybe a little bit more, maybe it's 3 years ago now. But one of the reasons for that is because the parties used to keep a bench ready to move the older guys out and move the younger people up. So that, for example, when you get FDR, he's part of a bench. He's part of a bench that Al Smith is running from New York. And when he moves forward, the other guys who don't move forward support him. And that the loss of that bench, if you will, of the party structure that creates succession really matters. So if you think about this moment right now, one of the things Trump has done is he has destroyed the Republican Party. It is now the Trump Party. And I don't mean that as in any way except where's the party structure that's going to keep that party going? It doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. He deliberately got rid of that. And so, again, normally, first of all, we've never had a party destroy its own speaker midstream, if you will. That has never happened in American history before. And then they couldn't find anyone to replace him. Five times they went through. They got rid of McCarthy. They went through 4 people. So who would they replace him with? I mean, you look like you're free.
No, you could not pay me enough money.
Well, that's just it. Nobody wants it.
Yeah.
So is it maybe safe because nobody wants it? But right now, as of today, I will not write about this tonight, but as of today, there's a huge furor over the Intelligence Committee. He has just removed the head of the Intelligence Committee, who was good. I mean, he's a Republican who was, had a great reputation.
Worked well with Democrats.
Mm-hmm, which is one of the reasons he's out. And so now he's got the Freedom Caucus. You got Chip Roy over there saying he's not going to support anything Johnson does. Now you've got the other side mad at him. And you've got the debt ceiling coming up. You've got the idea of this budget resolution coming up. And he's got slack of, is it 3 votes? 2 votes.
It depends whether people vote president or whether they vote, but technically right now it's 2 votes. If 2 people switch to the Democrat side, then that's
Which
it.
is
They
one of the
can't change
reasons
it.
they're saying that the woman who can't get in a plane because she's too pregnant can't vote proxy, is they want to keep as many Democrats away as they can. And I don't know. I listen to me, I'm speechless, because I'm good at the Republican Party. You know, I'm really good at the Democrats up until FDR. I'm not as good at them after that. But I'm good at the Republican Party. I should be able to tell you what's going to happen next, and I got nothing.
Well, keep watching CNBC because we got you. I did want to go back real quick to the lightning round just to get this one final name in. Elon Musk.
Oh, that's so easy. And now you got to ask me Peter Thiel too.
Okay.
And I'm going to make everybody mad when I say who Peter Thiel reminds me of. Elon Musk is Andrew Carnegie. I mean, that's just a no-brainer. Andrew Carnegie, because the guy who the steel baron from the late 19th century. And what I'm referring to when I say that is Carnegie, and by the way, not Carnegie, it's pronounced Carnegie. Carnegie was richer than God and squirrelier than hell. And he firmly believed that rich people should run American society and concentrate the wealth of the little people in their own hands for the good of humanity, and that the government should fund, should be arranged in such a way that it funded people like him.
Yeah, and so you asked about Peter Thiel, and obviously Peter Thiel is someone who has, he's part of the reason that J.D. Vance is vice president. He's kind of one of the first folks in Silicon Valley to kind of start making the argument and the case, I think, for Trump, if I'm remembering correctly, the article I read the other day. So who would he be?
I'm going to make everybody mad. Henry David Thoreau. Do you know why?
Why?
Because if you read Peter Thiel, and I was in a hotel room one night somewhere, and I did a deep dive on Peter Thiel and his writings, and because that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in how people think and why they act the way they do, and you can't see why they act the way they do unless you know how they think. And what really jumped out to me was that the way he is arguing about the way the world works sounds very much like a 16-year-old who thinks he is running everything and who lives on a neighbor's property and whose mother does his laundry and brings him cookies.
Can I ask for like an example? Like, is there something that really struck out to you about like something he said or something where it's like, oh my goodness, that really inspired that?
Well, so and I made you all mad, didn't I? So the idea that the way society should work is really that we should free up a very few very wealthy men to move beyond what they consider is the lives of quiet desperation, if you will, of the rest of us, is a lovely thought if it is completely divorced from actual society and the people who live in it. And that's what I mean by the comparison to Thoreau, who pisses me off in Walden. Not so much in his travel writings, but in Walden, where he's got all these great ideas about how wonderful the world would be if you did it all like him, except that he was living on Emerson's property and his mother was doing his laundry and bringing him food. So that idea, this vision of we could make the world great, we could create these societies that are divorced from actual people, where we will all live in this new world, just struck me literally that night as being a modern day version and a much less well written version of Thoreau.
Interesting.
Of Walden.
I also did want to ask who, and this one is not really part of the lightning round, but who is your favorite historical nonfiction writer besides yourself?
Oh, I don't like my own writing at all. Okay. Historical nonfiction. I'm reading a lot of, that's such a, I can't do my favorite, right? There are brilliant writers out there right now, truly brilliant writers in all these different fields. And that's one of the things that is most amazing in this moment is when you get these periods of great turmoil, you also get great writers. So, not a historian, but Anne Applebaum, brilliant writer. Rebecca Solnit, brilliant writer. Just as writers. Who's writing, are you asking me who's writing great history right now? So I read, I don't want to give you that one because that person writes like they're on fire. I read something just the other day and was so impressed. You know who's written a really good book? I mean, this is not a classic book. It's coming out. It's brilliantly written. What was I reading? I'm reading George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia right now. That's brilliantly written, of course. You want somebody modern.
You can't think of it, just throw it in your newsletter and we'll all tune in to see
Well,
who you pick.
somebody suggested what I really should do, because people write me these great stories about their lives, that I should ask people to send me stuff, and then once a week I should do a newsletter that's the things people have written me that week. Does that sound interesting? Yeah. I thought that sounded great.
Yeah.
And then people would have suggestions, because I have favorite books, but Buddy, who is it that I said I would read the phone book if they wrote it? Rebecca Solnit is one. I don't know. I can't answer that.
No,
one.
I think, hey, you gave us a lot of really good names, which I think was the point of the question. Well, I know we are a little over on time. We got started a little late, so I want to go a little over. But I know that folks have things to do, like eat dinner and have a glass of wine, another glass of wine, hopefully. So before we conclude today's discussion, I did want to take just a moment to thank our headliners, team co-leaders, Donna Lyon-Lanlinger, Lori Russo, and Jeff Judson. Thank you guys so much. Thank you as well to Club Program Manager Cecily Scott Martin and Club Executive Director Didier Soji. And of course, also thank you to you, Heather, for being here, for sharing your insights with us. And we'd like to award all of our guests a ceremonial mug from the National Press Club. It has been given to heads of states, to ambassadors, to Brooke Shields, and we are delighted to give it to you as well.
And it's got an owl on it.
Yeah.
Does that mean we're wise?
That's what we hope to imply with it, yes. And finally, of course, thank you to everyone who came tonight. We hope you will join us again on January 23rd when we'll hear from journalist Robert Rand, whose new book, The Menendez Murders, revealed new evidence in the case, and Ana Maria Barlat, the Menendez brothers' cousin, who has advocated on their behalf. And now for one final question, I wanted to end. We have a perfect question from the audience for this. We have a young person, 23, yes, that is young, you got that, and a grad student trying to navigate the challenges of today's information ecosystem and the rewriting of history while still trying to contribute to our future positively. It's hard to be optimistic and courageous. What advice do you have for young professionals trying to balance the truth of our history with the hope and determination to improve our country?
That's a great question. And are you here still?
Hi.
What's your dissertation on?
I don't have a dissertation. Policy engagement project. They change all the terms all the time, but it's about civic engagement among students, like younger students.
So that's a really good question, because we're heading into a really scary time. And you see this every day, people who say, I don't want to know. I can't deal with it. There's too much coming at me all the time. And it's important to remember under those circumstances that is a device to make us all turn away, that there's too much coming at us all the time. And it's okay to tune stuff out. But one of the things that's really important is to have your friends, have your community, to make community, and to recognize that one of the ways that one pushes back against an authoritarian government is by behaving with joy, by doing the things that matter to you and that you can bring to the people around you. And I think those things matter, but as a scholar, what I would say is, I don't want to do what we have to do for the next 4 years. I'm tired. I've been doing this since 2015. And then a life before that, of course. And this takes a hell of a toll on my life. But we don't have any choice. We have to get up tomorrow morning. And we either can hide under our desks and let other people take care of it, or we can meet the moment. And as scholars, being honest, putting your head in your books or whatever it takes, and doing the best goddamn job you possibly can is a contribution not only to the United States of America, but also to the enterprise of humanity, which is self-determination and learning to live together. Not necessarily at peace, but not at war. And those things are really hard to do, and they take a lot of work. But at my age, it has been my experience that of those two options, turning away or doing the best job you possibly can at whatever brings you joy, the latter is the one at the end of the day that will save not only you, but all of us. And that's one of the things I think we're going to have to keep in mind going forward, because I don't think we have a choice.
Well, that was really, I think, a perfect note to end this on. Heather Cox Richardson, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is excellent.